Welcome to this special programme on the local and mayoral elections that will be taking place across Britain in a couple of weeks' time. Joining me in the studio to discuss the implications for the Muslim community and for the rest of us is Azad Ali, who's a regional coordinator with Engage, Lewis Bastion, who's a political analyst with the Democratic Audit, and political analyst Sukant Chandan. Joining me on the phone is Rashid Mohammed Khan, who was part of the Make Bradford British programme on Channel 4 recently. Azad, let me start with you. What do you think will happen in this set of elections? Do you think they're going to be a watershed elections? They come mid-term for the Conservative government. It's a very deep economic crisis. The by-elections, the most recent ones, haven't gone well. Think it's going to be a watershed or just business as usual?
I think, thank you for inviting me to the show. I think there's two things to probably highlight. First is the London election will probably be the one that will give you that indication. But the local ones, following what took place in Bradford, will actually give us a true reading of how far disconnected voters are from the mainstream parties. In terms of what do these elections mean, what we're looking from Engage, we've got a specific project called Get Out and Vote, is to increase the number of voters, specifically Muslim voters, who participate in the democratic process. And I think, because there are several types of elections taking place. You've got the London Mayoral elections taking place, you've got the local councils taking place, and also you've got referendums for directly elected mayors taking place in about 10 cities. But interestingly, you've got another election, which we hopefully will talk more about, which is the PCC elections to elect a police crime commissioner, which should be very, very interesting. This is the first time where our police forces will be run by a directly elected commissioner.
Lewis, what do you reckon? Is it going to be a significant set of elections? Will we be able to tell much about the political temperature in the country from these?
There are three elections, in a sense, going on. There's the election in London for the mayor, which is kind of a bit disconnected from other bits of politics, but is potentially the most important of them. There's the elections in Scotland, let's not forget, where the SNP are looking to broaden their control in Scotland to local government. And there's also the local elections throughout England and Wales. And we'll get lots of sort of low-level indicators of how people are thinking and voting in those local elections. Last year, Labour did very well in the big cities in the north of England and in the Midlands, not so well in some suburban and southern areas. And we'll have to see whether Labour's making any more progress this year.
So, what do you expect out of them?
I think this is going to be a historic election, especially the London Mayoral election, because I think what we're faced with now is a period in history in England where we're having Scotland, Wales and Ireland going in a leftward direction, and England more or less has been in a right-wing trajectory because of this neoliberal government, coalition government, the Lib Dems and the Tories. I think Galloway's win in Bradford is an interesting contribution to it all, because I think if young people, especially in London, and particularly those people who've been opposing the war and opposing the austerity, are inspired by what's happened in Bradford and connect with that candidate who's similar in a sense to George, who was Ken Livingstone. I think if the young people pick up on the trend from Bradford, then we could have a very interesting result. And if Ken wins in London, then that's going to be an interesting kind of positioning of the left or any sense of politics which opposes the austerity and the neoliberalism and the foreign policy which is coming out of the current government. So really it is a very critical election. If Boris wins and Ken loses, I think England may lose that small sense of momentum that was gathered in Bradford, and the left will lose that and will be on a continuing right-wing trajectory. So I think it definitely is a very historic election.
Well, let's go to Rashid, who's in Bradford. So big political upset in your city. Do you expect that trend to be followed in other places, perhaps in London, as Sukant was suggesting?
John, the subject politics, to be honest with you, I haven't really got much of a clue with it, to be honest with you. I have had a lot of calls recently. There were certain elections that were going on here in Bradford. One of the MPs actually resigned due to ill health. And it's something. The thing is, a lot of people were asking me to support, one side, and obviously there were a couple of parties that were involved. Me personally, I like to say, I've said it on the programme, I've said it on many radio interviews. no matter what we do, obviously, we need MPs, we need councillors. Obviously, it's the law of the land in United Kingdom. But there's a way of going about it, and my motto is, the base of it all is unity. And I've overheard, without mentioning any names, that's why with what I do, we try and stay neutral, with not upsetting any other party. I've overheard certain individuals and certain people sort of with bigging themselves up. By all means, you've got to blowing your own trumpet to get people to vote. But with respect and with due respect to other parties as well, not to sort of dishonour or sort of publicise any other party's wrongdoings or weaknesses. This is something as a Muslim we shouldn't do with any individual, not just with as in politics or anything. But I've overheard, and that's why I've sort of kept not away, but I've just kept a distance from it. I really haven't sort of looked into it. People have approached me in the past as well. People have approached me personally. Before I did the programme, standing up as a councillor in certain areas. But me personally, I've got to keep neutral with everything. I don't really want to upset, any party or anything like that. But actually, I don't know. I believe, and what we've been taught from our predecessors, results come from above. Decisions come from Allah, and the decisions that come from the heavens, depending on our deeds that come out of obviously with what we do. If we try and do, I hope I'm answering the question you're asking, John, and I know I'm diverting a little bit, but decisions that come from the heavens are depending on everything that comes on the earth. I believe, and Muslims, we should believe that decisions come from the heavens depending on what our actions. If our actions are good, then good decisions will come from the heavens, and if my actions are not good, obviously the decisions come down according to that. As long as it's done peacefully, as long as it's done with in our hearts, we don't have no hatred, it doesn't cause any sort of enemy between or territorialism, stuff like that, between parties, and it's done peacefully. And that's my motto, and that's what advice I can give, and to conceal, like you said, John, if we conceal each other's, weaknesses, wrongdoings, everyone's got something hidden in the closet. To conceal this, then we believe, and it says in books as well, Islamic books, that Allah will conceal our wrongdoings and our weaknesses. And if I try and we publicise somebody's wrongdoings or weaknesses, I'm only saying this because I've overheard certain individuals in the past, when it comes to politics, people putting those down, and I find it quite unprofessional. Any salesman, would never put any other product down. They'll talk about their own product, and we've got that through history with our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Okay, well, let me just stop you there and bring Azad Ali back in, because one of the things that was the programme that Rashid was on, Make Bradford British. You could argue that the George Galloway by-election victory did more to illustrate the fact that Bradford was British than any other single factor, because right across the board, and not just in the Muslim areas, there was a huge majority for Galloway. It kind of made that point, didn't it?
Yeah, no, I think the election results, when you look at it in Bradford West, it does indicate a very high turnout. I think it was around 60%, and it was across all the wards. The Respect Party did well. So it isn't just the Muslim vote that kind of won it, as maybe some people perceive. It was the local vote. People probably felt very disconnected to what the mainstream parties were offering. But I just want to add one point to what Rashid was saying there, which is about reliance on Allah and everything else, which is absolutely true and absolutely right. But also the tradition is that you tie your camel first and then rely on Allah. And the tying the camel here is, look, we've only got a couple of days to register to vote. There are many people who still haven't registered to vote because people are moving around and everything else. It is very, very important that we understand what the candidates are offering, what the parties are offering, and actually aspire to be part of that change. I think, it's very easy to kind of say, we rely on, God, or we rely on other people. But we have to individually, all of us, have to take that responsibility. And I think, I'm very, very pleased, and at Engage, what we've noticed is that the number of Muslims now that are participating in the democratic process in a more wider sense, and rather than just a Muslim issue kind of thing, is very, very encouraging. And I think long may that continue.
Well, Lewis, let's just examine that question, the participation question, because that isn't generally true, is it, that there's a sort of rising participation rate. In actual fact, probably over the last 20 years there's been an overall decline in participation in British politics, and if the Muslim community is bucking the trend, it is just that, it is bucking the trend. Do you think that this election will be sufficiently interesting, sufficiently galvanising for it to get above the trend?
I think there's enough going on in these elections, particularly in London, that's possible. You do have quite a clear choice of candidates between the two leading candidates, Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson. There obviously is a lot of work going on to engage people in politics. We also have the recent example of the Bradford by-election, where it's clear that people did change the narrative. They just voted for a candidate who'd been written off by most of the mainstream media. They participated in huge numbers in the by-election in terms of actually going out and voting. So the opportunity's there to register and to then go out and cast a vote. It could really make the difference this time.
I mean, Sukant, you were saying about the mayoral election that possibly Ken Livingstone may be able to ride the same tide that Galloway rode in Bradford West. But isn't there a difference in this sense that in this election, Livingstone's campaign probably stands nearer to mainstream Labour than in any of the previous ones? And if you look at the opinion polls, you can see why. For the first time, Labour's overall poll rating was higher than Livingstone's individual poll rating, whereas in the previous occasions, Livingstone was polling higher than Labour. Do you think he made the wrong calculation? Because that's what it looks like after Bradford. It looks, if he'd stepped 2 steps away from the Labour mainstream, he might be riding the Bradford tide, whereas stepping 2 steps towards it, it looks as if he's in a very close-fought race with Boris.
Now, I think there's definitely some truth in what you're saying. I think with politics now in England, and I'm specific to England, I think definitely the more pro-working class, the more critical the policies are in relation to British foreign policy, I think more it will chime with the electorate, and I think that's what Bradford showed very clearly. But I think Ken, I'm sure, recognises that. And I think when Ken is saying he'll reinstate the education maintenance award, that's about £30 a week for working class students in London, I think when he said during the pension strike that, quote unquote, they're screwing us all. And I think he recognises that the more strident he is in opposition to the government, that the more votes he will get. And I think there's 2 things that are probably very disconcerting for the government. It's Bradford and the August riot. And why is that? Because the August riots showed, and you don't have to agree with the rioters and what they did, but it showed that working class people who engaged in the riots transcended racial boundaries and national boundaries. So you had white working class estates who were pretty much in civil war against the police up in the north. And what Bradford showed, that I'd slightly disagree with Azad. I think the Muslim vote in Bradford was critical, and without that, I don't think George would have got in, which relates to the leading role, I think, of non-white communities in England that are pushing forward progressive and left politics. But I think, again, what Bradford showed, that some white working class people are willing to ally with someone who is seen generally as very pro-Muslim. So I think these 2 things, that people are transcending the racist divide and rule, which has been developing as a result of UKIP and the English Defence League and other far-right formations, is a very interesting development. But I think it definitely, and again, in agreement somewhat to your question, I think Ken is probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable, although he'll never say it, that he has people like Ed Miliband, who's a gormless leader. I don't know why Labour have got such a useless leader. But I think, yes, and other commentators have said that the Labour leadership needs to kind of just lose that Blairite kind of seizure that they're in. And the more they shed that, the more working class people will vote for some type of progressive alternative, arguably, to the current government that we have.
Do you think, Lewis, that Boris is a harder target for Labour and for Livingstone in the sense that he hasn't really tried to rule London in a traditional Tory manner? He's kind of, it seems to me, made the judgment that Labour is a kind of social democratic or left social democratic city, and you can't really play the sort of, the old Etonian, even though he is one. You can't really do it that way. Do you think that's made him a harder target for Labour?
Oh, undoubtedly. Johnson is not running as a kind of generic Tory. A generic kind of Tory candidate with no personality would lose London by miles. Johnson's different in that you're right, that he has adapted to sort of Yeah, London is a diverse social democratic city. Its political institutions were kind of designed by the Labour government and Livingston. It works in a leftish kind of way. Now, Johnson's done a few things which are sort of more right-wing, like raising the bus fares, cutting back social housing, etc. But he's not picked fights with anyone. He's really sort of adapted to this environment, which is funny, given that as a journalist, he often likes to provoke and outrage people. But as a politician, he's been very cautious. So, yeah, he's a much harder target than, say, a typical Tory or David Cameron would be.
Do you think, Azad, do you think that there's enough recognition that a Livingston administration would be fundamentally different to motivate people to go out and vote for him?
I think, generally speaking, Londoners are interested in what's happening to them. I think, you mentioned the austerity, transport. There's so many things happening in London that, ordinary people are worried about, housing, many things. So from our experience through engagement, in particular with the Muslim community, what we're noticing is that people are actually interested in the policies that these two candidates, and let's be honest, it is between those two candidates at the moment. What I think a lot of people do turn off from is the personality contest, the little kind of fight that Boris and Ken had actually did neither of them any favours. That's what our reading is. People are actually genuinely interested in, okay, what do you actually stand for? What kind of person are you? And what are you going to really do to make my life better in London?
So, I mean, I think many people, want the mayoral contest to rise above that. The two candidates, not least of all in the Newsnight mayoral candidate debate, said they wanted to do this, but it looked like they were mud wrestling by the end of the programme, didn't it? I mean, they expressed the idea, but they didn't get there, did they?
Yeah, no, and that's unfortunate. I think in the last few days it has changed quite a lot. That they are now both focusing on their respective policies, and I think as long as that remains, it will be beneficial. I think the other point to raise here is London is very different from Bradford. And I think, that we shouldn't get into this a comfort zone in comparing the two. That there are some things that are true of both areas, but I would say London has far more dynamic, is far more sophisticated, has many more factors to deal with than it does, in Bradford West. For one, you do have the inner city and the outer donut syndrome, and this is very, very important to understand. The other thing is, Londoners don't necessarily play the identity politics as people would do outside of London. London has been, as far as I can remember, for all the decades I've been here, a very cosmopolitan, multicultural place where people, they identify themselves as Londoners, not necessarily as Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Muslim or, white or whatever. They actually identify themselves as Londoners. So that kind of gives them that, they rise above the other politics that I think did take place in places like Bradford.
Okay, well, just let me bring Rashid from Bradford back in there. I mean, I guess, Rashid, whatever you think about it, all eyes are going to be on the Bradford Council result, and what they'll be looking for is whether or not the vote that George Galloway got in the parliamentary by-election translates itself into council seats. Do you have any sense of how that's going?
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a lot of celebrations. Like I say, I'm getting text upon text from various numbers before this sort of by-election as well, and even now with, I think George himself. I mean, I have met George, and he seems like a nice bloke. He's done things in the past as well, and he has got, a lot of support from the youth, from the women's side, with the Muslims. But I think he intermingles, and like I say, good leaders, great leaders sort of lead by example, as we know in the past as well. And like I say, he's gone into the mainstream, and like I say, he lives in like not a ghetto area, but just a normal. So he's been saying himself. I've overheard him, speaking with people on the streets in Bradford. He's had a lot of support. He's got a lot of support. Obviously there'll be opposition as well. But everyone I've come across, to be honest, majority of people I've come across, they're all actually with George. seems like a nice bloke. I mean, I personally, my motto is until we don't live and travel, we don't really get to know someone. You know, with due respect to George, he's done a lot in the past as well. He's took convoys abroad, you know, to countries where there's been sort of, you know, people in need. And like I say, I just hope, you know, the results, like I say, you know, obviously one is saying we can do it, but I just hope that we can sort of put these into practice and the results will be there. And like I say, I hope it's resolved peacefully, and I hope it can bring unity, and I hope, you know, that we can sort of better, you know, areas and individuals as well. But yeah, there is a lot of support in Bradford, you know, for George, you know, different areas, and everywhere you go, there's people, you know, like you see the picture of George himself, you know. So I just, like I say, I just hope I hope it's all positive, and I just hope we can all sort of benefit from it. That's all.
Lewis, just let me bring you back to the point that Azad made. Do you think there is a different dynamic in terms of politics and identification with religious or ethnic groups inside and outside London? Do you think that's two different stories?
I think it is. I think it's right that there is a sort of sense that we're all Londoners. Part of the identity of being a Londoner is having sort of a diverse cosmopolitan sort of circle. That's what London's like. The towns of the north are a lot more segregated, that you have sort of different residential areas where you have sort of overwhelmingly white populations here and Muslim populations here, and from different countries that people have come from. In London, there's nowhere really quite like that. Hardly anywhere in London is more than 60% one thing or another. So I think London politics is different. And the way that sort of Greater London politics works, there's quite a lot of sort of consultation, give and take, big city politics like you get in sort of New York or whatever. Whereas in other towns, sort of perhaps particularly Bradford, Burnley and places like that, it's a lot more polarised, and that people do have kind of identities that they sort of stick to.
Yeah, Sukant, what do you reckon on this? Because, I mean, maybe there's one thing to be said here is that the successive and quite fast waves of immigration of different communities into Britain have concentrated in London, so that's made it more diverse in terms of ethnic and religious backgrounds than certainly than anywhere else in the country.
I think it's true, obviously, that London is more diverse than other urban centres in this country, and also I think, especially up in North, I mean, I went to Bradford just after the riots over 10 years ago, and it's clear that town is very divided. But also the danger in saying we're just one cosmopolitan kind of, everyone in London feels as a Londoner. I don't think that's always necessarily the case. And the danger in that, it glosses over the real problems of white supremacy and racism that continue in London itself. Now, Mark Duggan got killed by who? By white police officers. He was executed in Tottenham. And so there's a lot of interesting issues in terms of race and identity in London, in terms of is there an agenda to try to encourage, especially our youth, to think we're living in a post-racial era now. I don't think we are, and that's the biggest danger. But I just wanted to come back just for a second on the personality issue between Ken and Boris, because I think there's a bit of an ulterior agenda going on here with the media in playing this up. Now, obviously, both candidates are contributing to this ego clash, which is inevitable in an election. But there's real, I mean, Ken and Boris are chalk and cheese. They come from totally different opposite political kind of stables and affiliations. There's real fundamental policy differences between the two. I know Boris, the first things he did was, as soon as he stepped into the office in London Mayor, he rolled back a lot of the progressive policies that Ken did. He got rid of, I know, straight away in the London office, he got rid of the subscription to the Morning Star, for example. But also, you know, got rid of the Respect anti-racist festival and a whole bunch of other progressive policies. I think the media establishment fear that these clear policies of Ken will resonate greater with the electorate. So they've played up these personality problems to gloss over the real policy differences between the two.
Okay, well, just let me ask you, we're just coming up to the break now, but just let me ask all three of you quickly to give a response to this question then. Given that perception is there, that it's a personality clash, do you think that this is something that is produced by directly elected mayors? We've heard we're going to be voting on in a whole raft of places about whether or not they should be there, but do you think it personalises the politics?
Definitely, it personalises the politics, but the personality involved, it's incumbent on he or she to put forward rigorous policies that I would argue that actually resonates amongst working class people.
Quickly, yes or no?
Yes, elected mayors do. They also tend to be bad for women and bad for people who are minorities in the local area.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think they do, but that's not to say personalities aren't important. Personalities are important, and I think a lot of people do identify with that.
Okay, thank you all for being brief, and we'll be back in the second part of the show to discuss this issue a little bit further. Well, welcome back to this second part of the election special, where we're looking at the mayoral elections in London, the local council elections around the country, and also the referendum on whether or not there should be a directly elected mayor in many British cities. Azad, just before the break, you and I think all of you here in the studio were saying that you thought that the directly elected mayors weren't a good idea, but do you think that they're actually going to get put through in the referendum? Do you think there actually will be cities that are, going to say yes, we want one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't necessarily think they're a bad idea or a good idea. I think it works different for different places, and it's really to do with the local people. If you look at where they are happening at the moment, whether it's in St Hamlets or Leicester or Newham, a lot of people say it's going well, but equally you'll find in other places people saying that there's too much power concentrated in one person. I personally think most of the 10 cities that are holding the referendum, I personally think most of them will push it through. I think what it does is it does help to galvanise more participation in the democratic process. I think one thing I've noticed is when people see that an individual rather than a collective is in power or can be held accountable, they seem to find it easier to identify and feel more secure in giving or empowering them on their behalf. Whereas when it's with a large group or a political party, for example, the way our national elections are held on a manifesto, people aren't sure, okay, I voted you in here, but 5 months in, something might come up and you'll do something which is completely opposite to what I want. And it's hard to hold a individual to account because they have to follow the party whip, which a lot of people don't understand. But I think, just moving on, there is another debate that needs to be had is in the way the elections are held. So, for example, in London boroughs, the local elections are held every 4 years. But in metropolitan districts or unitary councils, they're held by a third every year. And that's also quite confusing. And a lot of people, I think, would probably prefer that the elections are held for the whole council once a year, once every 4 years.
Lewis, so just to stay on the question of the directly elected mayors, I mean, you were saying that they're disadvantageous for some very important elements in the community, but it's also true that where they exist, the kind of people that are elected can be, a long way outside the sort of normal political spectrum. I mean, we have, I think, a far-right mayor in Doncaster who's pushing through an extreme cuts programme. We've got the guy who stood as a monkey being elected in Middlesbrough. It's not exactly an advert for the process, is it? No,
I think mayoral elections, sometimes they work very well. A number of London boroughs, it has given a great clarity to their leadership. Sometimes it's not worked so well and people vote in a kind of rather eccentric way, almost as a kind of joke. When the man in the monkey suit was first elected, he was there as a joke, but he's been re-elected twice because he's actually turns out to be quite good at the job. So it's funny how these things work out. I think as far as these cities that are coming up now, I think it's very likely Birmingham's going to get an elected mayor. There seems to be quite a view in Birmingham that the city suffers a bit from not having a single voice, doesn't quite punch its weight as the second biggest city in Britain. It could do with a figurehead. In other cities, I think people in Manchester, well, we'll see if I'm right on election day, but generally feel their council does a reasonably good job with the current system of a council, a leader and a chief executive. So I think there will be a difference between results in different cities in these mayoral votes.
Sukant, what do you reckon?
Well, if a man in a monkey suit can be elected and re-elected as mayor of an English city, what does that say about our politics in this country, really? But rather more seriously, there's 2 points I really like to make, and it's connected to the monkey suit point, really. is that there is a danger, obviously, in election to mayor becoming nothing much better than a student union election, right, based upon just nonsense and kind of shallow popularity. And actually, I think that's kind of reflected in Boris being the mayor, which is just, he gets away with doing some quite anti-working class policies and enactments because he's some buffoon figure that we can all just laugh about. And I think that probably more than anything is the kind of the propagandistic weight that he has amongst his constituency, that he's just kind of a funny guy, kind of thing. But the second, I think, more serious point really is where institutional politics are at, or where they're not at, and the alienation from the main political parties as a result of their austerity measures, particularly, and the alienation from the electorate. So in that sense, whoever accomplishes the election to the mayorship, if they have policies and a position that actually resonates positively with the electorate, as I think Ken Livingstone definitely did. Now, the Mayor of London has relatively little power, considering it's a financial centre of the world, etc. But I think because Ken did enact some policies that made a very real difference to Londoners' lives, then I think that's a good thing. So it depends who wins, frankly,
Okay, well, we're joined now from Bradford by Furqan Naeem, who's chair of the University of Bradford Student Union Council. So he actually is involved in student politics as opposed to an election that may turn out like student politics. So Furqan, how do you think that the council elections are going to go in Bradford? Are we looking at another upset up there or not?
Well, it seems like so on the ground. I was here when George Galloway won his election a few weeks, and it was really how he with the young people and students on board. Right across the background, young people, students just resonated with him and joined on, and they felt a bit disillusioned with the local kind of like Labour Party that's been in power for a long time. I think a lot of the clan politics that was around here, and a lot of the young people didn't want to be part of that, and they wanted an alternative. And now, since Galloway won his seat, I think the Respect Party are putting a lot more candidates, and credible candidates as well, people who've been based in Bradford for a long time, people who've got that community experience here, and they're putting them up, and they feel like they've got a chance to take over some of the council positions as well. But the thing is, I think that they've carried on that momentum from winning a few weeks back and trying to win as many seats as possible as well.
So would you say that one of the things, I mean, we hear about the Muslim vote and again and again from analysts, but would you say that it would be as true to say that it was a youth vote?
Yeah, I think, well, from my angle, young people and students did make a huge difference in the election. They were the driving force behind the campaign. They were out every day in their droves, coming out, campaigning. People who've never been part of the political system before, people who've never voted in their lives before, people who are quite apolitical and don't know what's going on, all of a sudden were involved for the first time in their lives, and they enjoyed it. And, they were on the bus going round up and down around Bradford. They were going out in their cars, but, they were taking part and getting all their friends to vote. So I think young people did definitely make a difference. And whether they, found it, just a buzz to follow a celebrity-like figure, or whether George Galloway played on the Muslim card, he played to the politics of the place where he was doing his election. He's a clever man, and he did what he had to do. And people could argue what playing the Muslim card might have been a bit wrong, but that's what he did, and he went over the young people and students who were the driving force behind his campaign.
I mean, in a way, what Galloway did was it wasn't the Muslim card; it was the anti-war card, and that sentiment may be more heavily concentrated among the Muslim population. But when you've got 65% of people in this country who are against the war, it's not much more than it is among the general population.
Oh, quite. I mean, it's interesting because this concept of it's the Muslim vote. I mean, well, what defines the Muslim vote then? And as you're saying, it's perhaps more or less an anti-war vote. So anti-war sentiment is not confined to the Muslim community at all. And I think I don't know who I think it was perhaps before the show, someone said Bradford showed that it is a British kind of election result. But then what is Britishness? So all these concepts really are up for debate and up to be defined. I'm of the opinion that white working class people have a vested interest in opposing British foreign policy, because it's the same powers who are oppressing other people who are oppressing them, at home here. So I don't think it's something just for the Muslims. And before 9/11, there was a anti-war movement as well, and it wasn't necessarily comprised majority of Muslims either. I remember the first Gulf War was opposed. There was massive demonstrations against the first Gulf War in the early 90s, and I don't remember it to be majority Muslim demonstrators then. But I think no one has to be a supporter of George Galloway necessarily in Bradford to understand that what happened in Bradford was, and I'm not going to use profuse language, but it was a kind of get on your bike to the government, basically, and that's what it represented. And I think what George has done in terms of, there's obviously a problem in his celebrity status, which kind of perhaps takes away some of his real politics, but also in the day and age that we're living, him engaging in celebrity politics and making a celebrity name for himself through Big Brother, and particularly his talk radio show, which I think more than anything has convinced the white electorate that, okay, this guy, doesn't matter, we got some issues with, his views about Islam and Muslims, but he's obviously, he can vocalize our opposition and our feelings of alienation and anger, frankly, against the coalition government. So it's not a Muslim vote, and I would really like to see more people, especially the white people in this country, engaging these issues and overcoming those divide and rule kind of atmosphere that we've been seeing for the good part of our last decade.
Lewis, do you think that maybe that's one of the things that happened in Bradford with Galloway this time, that perhaps didn't happen in 2005 when he was elected in Bethnal Green and Bow? You had the war then, and you've got the war now, but now you had a very, very sharp, probably played more of a part in Galloway's campaign than the war. The question of austerity, it came just after the budget when the government was absolutely being slaughtered for a week. Do you think that's what helped push that majority up to 10,000?
It must have been. I think it took place at a time when, as you say, bits of the budget kept kind of falling off, as it were, and became unpopular. And people felt like, I think, somebody who was going to say sort of no in no uncertain terms. Whereas Labour, as sort of aspiring to be a government, kind of feels it has to take a more nuanced kind of view. So I'm sure that the anti-austerity, send a gesture message was a very important part as to why everyone, Muslim, non-Muslim, voted for Galloway in Bradford.
Azad, just before we sort of move on beyond sort of consequences of the Bradford election, but there's one thing which ties it in with the mayoral results in Birmingham, where Lewis was saying they look likely to agree that there will be a directly elected mayor. And some people are saying if that happens, then Liam Byrne, who's the Labour MP for Hodge Hill, is known to want to run for mayor. If he does, that means a by-election in Hodge Hill. That would be a strong area if Salma Yaqub, the leader of the Respect Party, stood there. Do you think there's a debate going on in Labour saying we need another Bradford like we need a hole in the head?
Well, probably. But I think the way I'd like to look at it is actually that there are just so many opportunities coming up. I think, it's not just Bradford, or George Galloway or Respect Party. I think the number of opportunities that are coming up and are being seized, as Furqan just mentioned, by young people who are very apolitical or, didn't even vote before, to now not only engage but also put themselves up to be a candidate. I think this is an aspect that we've left out. The number of, especially Muslims, that we're saying joining not just mainstream parties but smaller parties as well, and saying look, I've got an interest, I want to stand. It is fundamental. And I think the mayoral elections, places like Birmingham, if these dynamics do take place, I think it does create an opportunity for someone like Salma Yaqub to stand. And I think there's every chance that she can win there. But more importantly, what I'd like to highlight is that through that opportunity and those vacancies that will be created, the number of Muslims in particular that will get engaged is fantastic.
Let me put the same question to you, Sukant. You've been talking about the democratic deficit. It's in all the social attitudes things, it's very, very marked now. But apart from particular instances, it doesn't seem to impact on the establishment political system other than it losing legitimacy among the mass of the population.
I think we have to go into quite a detailed conversation, which we probably won't be able to in this show, in terms of why doesn't then that translate into, you know, a very real left victories then in England. But I think we're going into a historical period where really there's a crisis, there's a multifaceted crises that England is facing. It's perhaps going to lose Scotland in the not too distant future. That will break the oldest colonial entity on the planet in half, and it will completely bring it to its knees. That impacts on so much in terms of economy and culture and identity in England. I mean, what we're going to do without most of our armed services, what we're going to do without a nuclear Trident submarine, you know, what is England's status going to be in the world? I mean, England and the British government is obsessed with trying to, and it will never bring it back, but trying to bring back this old British colonial past in trying to say we're going to, punching the table over the Las Malvinas, over the Falklands, and trying to relive this colonial past. And I think these things and others are going to feed into a greater alienation in England. And where that's going to go, I'm not so sure. I don't see it going in a particularly positive direction in the foreseeable future. But if the left formations in England can get their act together, which I don't think they've really done so far, I mean, why is it that the left, for example, can't win in majority white working class areas, and we have the English left always kind of borrowing upon victories in non-white or black areas? So this is perhaps a subjective discussion that needs to be had in the context of these very objective situations that we're going through historically right now.
Well, Lewis, let's talk a little bit more about Scotland then, because I mean, I think unless you've either been following it or you've been there, perhaps, you know, viewers won't understand quite how different the political system already is in Scotland, because essentially in England the two main parties are still dominant, but in Scotland really what you have is two versions of left politics in a way. You've got at least a centre Labour Party with a social democratic history, and the SNP, you know, long past the point where they could be described as Tartan Tories, are really a nationalist left social democratic formation. So it's between two Labour-type organisations, and the Tories have been eliminated. I mean, that is an incredible development, isn't it? In a particular part of what may or may not be the United Kingdom for very much longer.
It is, and it's been a sort of developing story since the 70s, but the Conservative Party fell off a cliff in Scotland in the 80s and 90s, and it still hasn't got back up. I mean, they have one MP from north of the border. They managed to get a transfusion of people enough to staff the Scottish office by coalescing with the Lib Dems, but if the 2011 elections are any guide to it, the Lib Dems are going to be wiped out as well. So it really is a sort of almost Scandinavian social democratic polity attached to something very different in England, which is a sort of rather more mid-Atlantic sort of right-of-centre individualist political system. And there's got to be a question as to how long such a kind of marriage between these two bits can last. In the past, there's been a lot of compromise and acceptance on both parts, but it seems to be kind of fraying at the edges. The SNP is becoming ever more kind of dominant in its role in sort of not just political life in Scotland, but civic life. There used to be a kind of Labour consensus establishment view in Scotland. It's now being replaced, I think, by a rather nationalist view. I think these are huge changes going on, and Scotland really is, you have to look at its politics and its party system in a completely different way to England.
Azad, I mean, you'd have to say as well that both Tories and Labour are, seem to be covertly campaigning for devolution max. I mean, every time they touch this issue, they build support for the SNP, don't they?
Well, yeah, they have, and I think what Lewis just mentioned there is probably the ideological change that's taken place in Scotland in terms of how Scottish people identify what the key things for them has shifted from just being socialist to more nationalist socialist, if you like, identifying with their nation first, and that, you know, what you mentioned about the freedom, the separation from England, all of that is far more pronounced now than it has ever been. And I think inadvertently the two main parties have caused their own kind of demise.
So, Sukant, I mean, do you think that that perhaps what we're seeing is that, a monolithic system, and the British system has been, you know, a monolithic system for a very long time, it begins to crack on its fault lines, doesn't it? I mean, that's and you'd almost expect that to happen. You don't necessarily expect it to crack first in its heartland.
Yeah, I think it's kind of reversing the historical process of colonization on these islands itself. It's the colonized people by the Anglo-Saxons, i.e. the Celtic peoples, who are slowly taking revenge on what's happened to them. Because the same process is happening in Wales as well. Now, the Welsh nationalist leader of Plaid Cymru is a self-professed Republican and a socialist. And also, which is always forgotten, is the other Celtic nation on this island, which is Cornwall as well, which has a small nationalist party, which is growing as well, which is very similar in its politics to the left nationalism of Plaid Cymru and the SNP. So this really is perhaps one of the most interesting leftward trajectories in the whole Western world. And the fact that Scotland's possible breakaway from the United Kingdom, what ramifications that will have for British neo-colonialism, obviously England, you know, Westminster is fearing. And it's an interesting point what you made about how the Tories are kind of doing the SNP's job for them, but they can't help themselves. And frankly, unionism, British unionism is evident throughout the political spectrum in England. And the British media and all the major parties, whenever they open their mouth about Scotland, yes, they absolutely incense Scottish people and increase that nationalist sentiment. Actually, just anecdotally, the Scottish people are very radical, and they have a very strong and living socialist and nationalist consciousness. My friend said, he's a quite well-known rapper, and he says the Scottish people are the only people he knows that if you just throw them a bunch of guns and say go fight the English, they'll probably go and do it. You know.
Okay. Well, let me. Furqan's back on the phone now, so just let me bring you back into the conversation. Do you expect that kind of mood among young people, you know, people who've been locked out or feel locked out of the establishment political system? Do you expect that to spread beyond Bradford? Do you think it's going to manifest itself in this whole set of elections?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you're seeing, and it's not just in Bradford. I think Bradford was an example of that, but I think it's happening up and down the country. Young people are just feeling disillusioned with politics as a whole. And I was on Newsnight the other night. We were talking about the upcoming possible mayoral elections that you touched upon before, the impact that will have on young people. What they're seeing right now is election point. What young people want to see now is some sort of accountability and transparency. And the students and young people are focused now much more on issues that affect them directly rather than party affiliation. And I think that's what you're seeing. And now what parties have to do, political parties, they have to resonate and touch upon the young people and student issues a lot more than before, because their votes are going to make a difference. We saw that in Bradford, but I think we're going to see right across the country. Young people, they do want to get involved. They want their voices to be heard. They want an opinion to happen. But at the moment, they're just feeling a bit disillusioned with all three of the main political parties, and they're trying to find that voice across in something else. And if it's not in the three political party system, then it will be through other means. There is a lot of disenfranchisement at the moment, and I think Bradford's just an example, and you'll see a lot more happening around the country.
I'd have to bring you to a close there, because that's all the time that we've got to discuss these issues today, but you can look out for the results coming your way pretty soon, and then you'll be able to tell whether or not the panel were right or wrong, and we'll be back to judge that after the elections.